All right, so State Department spokesperson Ned Price was recently pressed yet again by journalist Matt Lee, who has been very consistently solid at pushing back against a lot of the propaganda coming from the U.S. State Department. So I wanted to play this clip here for you guys. This one is specifically Matt Lee pointing out the hypocrisy of the United States, condemning Chinese interference or domination over Taiwan, while simultaneously still imposing a now 60-year-long embargo on the country of Cuba. So let's go ahead and jump into this.
Following this idea that big states can dominate small states. So, there are a lot of historians which would say that the United States itself has had that same policy particularly towards countries in Latin America. But since we're talking about Taiwan in this instance, let's talk about small islands that are off the coast of each country. How exactly would you describe U.S. policy towards Cuba? Is that not the case of the same thing of what you're accusing the Chinese of doing with Taiwan? And if not, why not?
Matt, I think you can compare what Beijing is doing to Taiwan with clear acts of intimidation, flying sorties into what is clearly if Matt, Are you going back 60 years? Is that where you're going to?
Sure. I go back longer than
Matt, we've had this conversation before. I'm here to speak to the Biden administration, not to the Kennedy administration or the Eisenhower administration.
Okay, so let's talk about the Biden administration and its policy towards Cuba, which still has the embargo, right? Is that not a case of a big state trying to dominate a smaller state? This is exactly the same thing that you're complaining that China's doing.
This is a case of the United States seeking to help advance the democratic aspirations of the people of Cuba. If you take a look at what we've done, including in recent weeks, we've taken steps that seek to fulfill those aspirations. Family reunification, visa processing, providing support to Cuban entrepreneurs, taking measures of accountability on senior Cuban officials who've been responsible for the repression, including the renewed repression that has followed the July 11th protests. So our approach to Cuba, I think, is the comparison you're trying to make.
I'm not trying to make the comparison. I'm asking you if there is a comparison.
Okay, so I guess the answer would be no. Yes, great.
Okay, so I mean, listen, the answer is yes, there is definitely a comparison, and I think that it's absolutely hilarious that Ned Price actually had the audacity to push back against Matt Lee's question by saying, well, what are you trying to go back to 60 years ago? While he's actively explaining how the Biden administration is still imposing the same embargo from 60 years ago. So yeah, of course, it's of historical and current relevance to bring up 60 years ago in the politics of what caused this type of relationship to happen in the first place, because you're still doing the same exact goddamn thing. So the fact that he would laugh at that and insinuate that he's only talking about the Biden administration and their specific policies, well, your specific policy towards Cuba is the same thing the United States has been doing for decades against this country. So of course it's comparable to the situation with China and Taiwan. If anything, you could definitely make the argument that the U.S. has been historically much more aggressive towards the island of Cuba than China has been towards Taiwan. And listen, I'm not going to sit here and pretend like Cuba doesn't have some of their various flaws or anything like that. You don't have to be a cheerleader for any governments or institutions around the world, but the fact of the matter is the United States does not give a single solitary shit about promoting freedom and democracy within Cuba. I mean, if you want to look at the historical examples, the United States was supporting the dictator who was in power, Batista, and his regime that was violently suppressing all of the different values that he is pretending to care about right here. The United States official position before the revolution was supporting that dictatorial regime that just so happened to support the interests of U.S. capitalists. And so you then turn around, you have the Castro Revolution, and of course the United States and our business, corporate America-controlled government doesn't like that revolution and them kicking out, the wealthy capitalists from their country. But, the idea that you care about promoting freedom and human rights and democracy in this country is just fucking laughable. I mean, all you care about is extracting their resources, exploiting their labor. That's been clear throughout the entire history of this relationship. And, just to put it a little bit more in perspective in terms of those recent protests that he was talking about, I'm sure that there were some legitimate protests and some people who were pushing back against, more authoritarian measures that have been taken by the Cuban government. But this was the same series of protests that we saw around, I think it was July 11th, as he was pointing out there, where there were some protests, but a lot of these were being heavily, amplified basically by U.S. corporate media outlets. In fact, they were going to such a degree to amplify these protests and pretend as if this was going to be the overthrow of the current Cuban government that they were literally posting, from multiple mainstream media outlets, posting pictures of larger pro-government protests that were happening around the same time and claiming that they were anti-government protesters. And listen, you wouldn't have to do too much research to see that this is a pro-government protest in this instance. You literally have the revolutionary July 26 flags that are sticking up here right smack dab in the middle of the picture. So, pretty lazy journalism, but again, that's sort of the dynamic that a lot of those protests were under. Again, not trying to claim that there was no legitimacy to a lot of the claims that those protesters had, but from the perspective of the U.S. State Department, okay, that's what you have to understand. They do not care about human rights or democracy or freedom of speech, okay? Joe Biden is about to go meet with Mohammed bin Salman, the leader of Saudi Arabia, and initially I had thought that he was doing that to try to get some lower gas prices. Turns out it's not even about that. He's going there just to, help Israeli security, is I guess under the framework of what they're saying that they're going over to do. But you're going to meet with Mohammed bin Salman, probably the single worst violator of human rights and freedom of the press, and conducting a genocide in Yemen right now actively that we are supporting. You're going to meet with him. So, again, we saw this at the Summit of the Americas as well. You have Biden banning governments from Guatemala, governments from Venezuela, government representatives from Cuba, etc. You had the Mexican president who abstained from this, and he's going there to this Summit of the Americas pretending like he cares about promoting freedom of the press and democracy and all of this. Well, he was simultaneously meeting with like Jair Bolsonaro. It's a complete fucking joke. The United States State Department does not care about promoting those values. All they care about is who is going to be an ally to us. And in this case, the allyship basically just means, are you willing to let U.S. corporations extract your natural resources? Are you willing to open up and privatize your markets and basically conduct neoliberalism in its modern current form, which in a lot of these poor countries basically just means being put under the boot of the American empire? So that's the perspective that he is really running with here, as he is, laughing about this and pretending as if the U.S. official position is somehow morally consistent with freedom of the press and democracy and all of these other things. Again, this isn't just historical examples, as was the case with Cuba, which, by the way, if we want to talk about the history of all of this and the extent to which the United States was willing to go in order to overthrow the Castro government, here from ABC News, they say U.S. military wanted to provoke a war with Cuba. So what were they doing? They say, here from May 1st, 2001, in the early 1960s, America's top military leaders reportedly drafted plans to kill innocent people and commit acts of terrorism in U.S. cities to create public support for a war against Cuba. They were planning terror attacks on U.S. citizens in order to justify overthrowing this government, okay? This is who he wants you to believe, historically and in the modern sense, as we're supporting dictatorial regimes all around the world, supporting a genocide in Yemen, all of these different things. This is the same government he wants you to believe cares about human rights abuses. It's just a complete fucking joke. I don't know how anybody in their right mind could possibly believe that. But on top of this, it was also disingenuous for him to say that this is just a matter of history, right? We're on to the Biden administration. Let's forget about all of those past issues, because the Biden administration is not only maintaining a lot of those previous policies that have been deployed for decades in basically trying to suppress Cuba, but on top of that, Biden has been adding even more sanctions on this country. So he's making the situation worse, and you should have to answer to that instead of just pretending like this is about promoting freedom and democracy within this country. He's imposing more sanctions than, even the 200 plus sanctions that were put in place under the Trump administration as well. And in terms of the costs of this, think about how much money they've been losing. Here from Reuters, they estimated at like 130 billion, but I would not be surprised if this is more so on the lower estimates, because you're talking about a country that for decades has been, not allowed to seriously interact with the global economic system in the way that their people want to. And so, this is what the policy of these economic sanctions are actually doing. It's warfare. This is, why people come out and they say that sanctions are the equivalent of economic war, because it has actual material consequences for average people who are living in these countries. And so, of course, there's just so much potential that has been wasted in Cuba, a country that has produced, better results depending on which which different sectors you want to look at. They certainly have a better healthcare system than we do here in the United States. They have a higher life expectancy. They've dramatically, since the revolution, improved their education system. I mean, so many different things that we could actually look to this country to improve upon our own country, but instead they're trying to pretend as if this is the single greatest threat to human rights and democracy that exists on the planet, so we have to completely try to economically strangle this country while we're, oh, by the way, behind the scenes going and meeting with, human rights abusers and war criminals like Mohammed bin Salman. Again, just a complete fucking joke, but just to put it in full perspective here in terms of understanding that this is not just my perspective being against this ongoing embargo, this is the global perspective in a near unanimous sense here from the UN General Assembly. They had another call for the U.S. to end the Cuban embargo for the 29th consecutive year. And look at their fucking results here. I mean, you have in favor of removing the embargo 184 countries, okay? And against removing the embargo, you had 2 countries, all right? One of which is the United States. Can you guess which one is the other one? It's Israel. I mean, again, no surprises there. So you had 2 countries voting against Israel and the United States. And then in the abstention here, you had 3 other countries, which were Ukraine, and then you also had Colombia and Brazil, all countries that at the time of this vote had far-right leadership who were basically working in tandem with the United States as well. So, I mean, listen, to come full circle here, again, it's not to say that there's no valid criticisms whatsoever that you could level at the Cuban government. Definitely not saying that. But again, on the flip side of that, there's a lot of things that we could probably learn from this style of governance, or learn from this style of, investing in your people, promoting just the human necessities and basics like education, healthcare, etc. So many different things that we could actually learn from this country if we weren't continuing to impose this embargo. And, on top of that, sanctions as well. But I mean, listen, this is why it's important to have a free press that is actually free. People like Matt Lee, fantastic journalists like Abby Martin as well, who are able to put these people under, some degree of pressure. This is not the type of question you would ever hear from an MSNBC host or a CNN host, certainly not a Fox host, but, these are the types of questions that keep them on their toes at the very least, and make them at least make attempts to try to confront the glaring hypocrisy that is baked within the U.S. State Department.